Hi, my name is Leigh Bernacchi. I work at the University of California, Merced for the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society. I'm also a social science researcher with an interest in water, natural resources, and public participation. So you are my people. We have published a paper called Glass Half Full, and it's available in the Science of the Total Environment journal. But I'll be sharing some additional analysis, and I wanted to offer an invitation to reach out to me if you're starting on a media analysis and if you're interested in some weird ways of using in vivo for qualitative or quantitative analysis, or if you just are curious about groundwater. I wrestled with this topic quite a bit and I'd love to share some of the methods. I wanted to start this like as if we were in the same room. Where does your water come from? Is it from groundwater? Is it surface water or another source? I think it's important that we continuously ask ourselves, where does our water come from and how can we participate in its management? To that end, for public participation, I was curious about how media representation influences public capacity to participate in a novel groundwater law that we have in California. We're the last state to finally regulate our groundwater. But I had to query the media to see how do we represent groundwater, how do we represent this law, and who's represented in that. So that's the crux of this. So groundwater is poorly represented in water cycle imagery, which also lacks a lot of anthropogenic sources. It is hard to understand. It's the dark matter, as my colleague Graham Fogg calls it, or it's just invisible. We don't really understand where it is or what it looks like, and it's difficult to conceive of. But it is a critical resource, especially in Mediterranean climates where the water is not available at the time that the agriculture is growing. So you have to compensate if it's not delivered via surface water resources by using well water, or it's a critical resource for rural communities where people often have their own well or are connected to a small water system. Groundwater is also a savings account that enables us to overcome drought. So in 2014, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed as a series of 3 bills. It had large bipartisan support, but it did not have the support of the geographic region that it mostly governs. I laughed when I came upon this graphic because it seems so simple. Step 1, form a groundwater sustainability agency, a group of people who have never worked together. Maybe they've litigated each other. They've fought over water, they've fought over land use, they fought over other regulations, and have them all get together. And then step 2, they write a plan that will determine land use, fees, who can trade what water where and with whom. And just turn that plan into the regulators, and easy peasy, step 3, achieve sustainability in 20 years or so. So the planning horizon is to 2050, but we'll check back in 2040 to see how these critically overdrafted basins are doing, to see whether they've avoided this second part. The second graphic is the 6 deadly sins of Sigma, as we call it, the 6 undesirable consequences of groundwater extraction. Our analysis covers 3 readerships that we defined in California. 2 are based on the watershed of the Tulare Lake Basin or the San Joaquin Basin, and the third is the 10 most populous cities. We collected all of the news in these areas that contain the word Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, resulting in 325 articles that were analyzed via in vivo using an a priori code book that was based on water resources research in California over the past 20 years, media research as well as collaborative learning. And thinking about collaborative learning in terms of a scoping process, and the first thing that may happen to get people in the door is their encounter with the news media around this subject. Who are the stakeholders? Largely, the stakeholders represented the people who are most likely to already be involved in the management of groundwater and water resources more generally. I found it interesting that the agricultural industry appeared in nearly 40% of all Sigma articles, and was the same in Tulare Basin as policymakers. And this came at a time when California was investing heavily, or trying to invest heavily, in its water infrastructure. Water managers who may or may not be elected figured prominently, kind of to my surprise, because you don't think of them as spokespeople, but because of this high profile law, they often were the ones involved in the communication, as well as city and county officials who may or may not have been elected. They also co-occurred in Sigma articles. Academics and regulators like the State Water Resources Control Board appeared in about 1 in 10 Sigma articles. What are the solutions? So there are two main knobs on groundwater, or any water resource really. How much are you going to use, and how much can you get somewhere else, or how much are you going to save? So the supply and demand were extremely popular, but they varied by region. Obviously, Tulare Basin was looking for new supplies. They were thinking dams, other infrastructure like canals, how can we import more water? And San Joaquin Basin having more surface water, but also knowing that that was limited, focused more on demand reduction and conservation. So did urban areas, and I think this reflects that the urban areas were maintaining their drought conditions. How did stakeholders and solutions appear together? We did a principal components analysis, and I find it interesting that when these two interacted, it was like an old guard and a new guard. The old school is like agriculture and the water managers and the city and the politicians all get together and determine the supply and demand. But then the second cluster is like, what are we going to do different? Are we going to use economic solutions like water markets, water trading, incentives, taxes, land use breaks? How are we going to encourage farmers to fallow their land, or take marginal land out of production and increase our groundwater sustainability? Maybe they can recharge water on their land. Maybe they can use it for energy generation. A lot of interesting solutions appeared, and I think that these clusters illustrate the dominant narrative that was most common, but then there's this alternative story. I think it's also important to realize that any one story was most likely to have 0, 1, or 2 solutions or stakeholder categories represented in it. So that means most groundwater stories were probably about one agricultural industry representative and one solution. So what does that mean if that's the only story you read? Do you see yourself in it? How many of us are part of the agricultural industry? So, or are a lawmaker, or are in their district, or. And so I think the problem with common pool resources in this media representation is that the limited representation may lead to limited public participation. I also wanted to share some qualitative results just because these aren't in the other paper, but in these images, I just wanted to share that a lot of the discussion around subsidence was about explaining basically what it is, that it's a deadly sin of sigma, and that we know about it through extensive monitoring, both from NASA's satellite imagery and from these dedicated USGS scientists. So most of the media covered just baseline understanding. The rest of the media covered infrastructure problems, like how can you convey this water? And finally, only 3 or 4 of the articles really talked about the permanent damage of subsidence and the fact that it collapses the sands and then you cannot store it in this natural infrastructure of the aquifer again. Subsidence appears in 18 articles in the Tulare Lake Basin, which is a pretty small proportion, especially given that subsidence is one of the 6 deadly sins of sigma and one of the things we should be regulating. It appears in a higher proportion of urban area. I think it's also interesting that this law was written to address some of the ills of 1 million Californians not having water, reliable, secure source of water, either seasonally or permanently, a clean, reliable source of water. So those disadvantaged communities, depending on which definition you're using, are those that are disproportionately exposed to environmental ills, health problems, or water quality pollution, among other things. So the fact that both of these issues appear very infrequently, and actually only 2 out of 365 articles are quoting a person from a disadvantaged community, not the nonprofit that's speaking for them, poses a problem for how do people see themselves in relation to their resource. This is a long, ongoing problem. In their anonymity, state officials say the problem is almost a century old, and the new law represents a major shift in how water is managed, one requiring years to deal with the complexities involved. But I think that now is the time to transform the way that this resource and others are represented, because media is our way of seeing what is hidden, what's underneath, what's underground, and representing what is not transparent. California is a leader, and we need to consider that. This is not just an issue of media or public understanding of science or scientific communication. This is a holistic issue of how do we represent who a resource belongs to and who is invited to participate in its management through a variety of communications. Common pool resources have a common community, and I think that only part of that community is invited to participate in the media. Thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you.